Upstairs, are we ready? Thumbs up. Good evening. Thank you. And thank you for joining us tonight. I am Neil Lichtman. Tonight is Chapter 3 of Forging Futures. Our guest speaker is the Unitarian Universalist, Reverend David Pyle, and Reverend Mandy will give him a proper introduction after my brief remarks. You might recall that Chapter 1 of Forging Futures was in April, when the president of Meadville Lombard Seminary, Dr. Elias Ortega, brought two very highly regarded members of his staff here, one to present on educating students to become UU ministers, and the second, in his very seasoned judgment, what Unitarian Universalism should become. And in September, Chapter 2 of Forging Futures, Dr. Kate Ott, PhD, presented on the intersectionality of technology, sexuality, and faith consistent with our UU values. Both chapters of Forging Futures can be seen on YouTube at duuc.org. Tonight, we present a UU minister who is doing something rather unique and quite challenging. Reverend Mandy, the honor of properly introducing Reverend David Pyle is all yours. Thank you.
And thank you, Neil, for this brainchild of yours that we have taken on. It's such a lovely thing to be learning as we are a community together. And tonight I get the great honor of welcoming Reverend David Pyle, who I know because he was actually a regional staff member in the Central East region when I was at a congregation there. David Pyle also happens to have a similar trajectory into ministry that I have. He was an administrator before he became a minister. Not many of us, but a few. His official title, or introduction, Reverend Pyle holds a Master's of Divinity from Meadville Lombard Theological School. And by the way, he did his internship here in the Chicagoland area at the Evanston congregation. He has a Bachelor's of Art in History and Political Science from East Tennessee State University. He completed his CPE in Park Ridge, Illinois, and he has served as a minister in congregations in California, Michigan, and Illinois. He currently serves, and this is incorrect because this is your old, what is your current title in the military?
In the military?
Yes.
So I am, and I'll say that in a minute.
Okay, I will let David say that part.
I served as an Army Reserve chaplain.
Army Reserve Chaplain. He is also our Mid-America Regional Lead. So for those of you who are new to the structure of the UUA is set up by having divisions of the country that have staff who are our contacts in smaller sections. And so the Mid-America goes from parts of Ohio all the way to western Nebraska and all the way up to Canada and down to Tennessee. Tennessee-Kentucky border. And David Pyle is the regional lead for all 183 congregations in that area. He is not our regional contact, that would be Sharon Dittmar, but he is Sharon's boss and the liaison between us and the UU world. And he is a friend, and for that I am most grateful. Welcome, David.
So thank you for that gracious introduction. I am Chaplain Major David Glenn Pyle. So I have these two ministries, and I get to be in both of them. And in one of them, I am Chaplain Major David Pyle, and in the other, I am the Reverend David Pyle. And I will tell you, it is very fun to be able to say which role I'm in at a moment. So tomorrow morning, for those of you that are coming, Reverend Mandy and I, dear colleague, are going to be co-preaching a sermon and dialogue, and in that moment, I will be the Reverend David Pyle. So it's good to be here. I want to thank Reverend Mandy and thank Neil for inviting me to come be here with you all. I first came in the doors of this congregation in 2008 when I was the district assistant on the Central Midwest District staff and a student at Meadville Lombard Theological School here in Chicago. So it's good for me to be back. A little bit about my military ministry role, and then I'll talk a little bit about my civilian ministry role, and then give you a little bit more on my career within the military. So I am currently assigned as the brigade chaplain to the 244th Expeditionary Combat Aviation Brigade, which is based out of Fort Knox, Kentucky. It is an Army Reserve unit, and my soldiers are responsible for all of the Army Reserve's aircraft east of the Mississippi River. There's another brigade that has west of the Mississippi River. But helicopters and airplanes, and I will tell you, they keep saying they're going to fly me around in this nice little, jet, and they haven't done it yet, but once they do, no ministry will ever live up to that ever again. So in the civilian ministry, I am, as Reverend Mandy said, I am your congregation's regional lead. And what that means is that I lead the staff team that provides support to the congregations of the Mid-America region, and also means that I both represent the congregations of the Mid-America region within the senior ranks of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and also to serve as the executive director of the nonprofit of the Mid-America region that your congregation and the other congregations of this region created to provide the services to congregations that we do, to support congregations in all the things that are their mission. And we are here this weekend doing several things, including a board retreat for the Mid-America Regional Board. And so I would like those members of the board that are here tonight, if you'd raise your hands for a moment so people can see you. They will also be there. I think most of them are planning to be there tomorrow morning for one of the two services, so feel free to grab them and talk about UUA things with them. So I grew up in the United States Army as a military brat. I was born at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. My father was a counterintelligence agent. He had been a military policeman prior to that. And so my early years were formed within the military community. Somebody once asked me what was my denomination growing up. I was about 14 years old at the time. What was my religious denomination? And the only thing I knew to tell them was chapel. Now, I didn't know my parents had us go to the most conservative theological chapel that was on every post, but chapel was and the chaplain was my vision in some ways of what it meant to be a community leader, of what it meant to care about people. So when I turned 17 years old, I did the thing that you do in my family when you are male and not out as being gay, or you joined the military. And so I did that at 17 years old. I joined the United States Army and went off to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and had an enlisted career that included both training at Fort Leonard Wood and at Goodfellow Air Force Base and at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and at Fort Moore. I then served with the 7th Special Forces Group out of Fort Liberty, North Carolina, doing counter-narcotics missions in Latin America for 4 years. And then I was one of the peacekeepers that went into Sarajevo in 1996 and was there in Sarajevo in the first phases of ending what at that time was the worst war that had been seen in Europe since World War II. I will tell you that those experiences, the experiences in Colombia and in Panama, and the experiences in Sarajevo, they are what brought me to Unitarian Universalism. That having grown up in a different faith tradition, having grown up with a different set of values than the experiences I had in other parts of the world, changed me and changed my view on those values. One therapist later told me that Bosnia in particular was my moment on the road to Damascus, for those that understand that theological. but having seen the worst that humanity can do to one another, having seen the results of greed and colonialism in Latin America, and having seen the results of religious hatred-fueled warfare in Sarajevo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I came back from those experiences looking for something else. I didn't know that initially. I had a wonderful, I was blessed that I came back to go to college at a university that was co-located with a veterans hospital, and they noticed I was struggling. And all of a sudden at this pool hall that I would hang out at, this nice Vietnam veteran started playing pool with me, and we'd talk. The first 3 sessions were at that pool hall. 4th session was in his office at the VA hospital. But at the end of a year of us having some deep conversations, he said to me, you know, David, you're a person that needs to understand a way of understanding the world. You need your values to be in alignment with your practice and I've had the privilege to listen to you for a year. Talk about the values that you hold and that you feel called to. I've never done this. I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist since Vietnam. But here are the 3 closest Unitarian Universalist congregations. These are your people. And he was right. So that's how I found my way into the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then later into the UU Fellowship of Galveston Island in Texas, where I later became the church administrator. In my civilian ministry, after a time as a special events coordinator, running food shows and trade shows, it was a lot of fun. But because food shows, I swear, they will feed you like you would not believe at a food show. But I had the ability, when our church administrator in my fellowship that I was a part of in Galveston, Texas, became ill. I remember the board meeting. I was on the board. I remember the board meeting where it said, somebody's got to go fill in for Rosemary. And my job running special events for the Galveston Historical Foundation gave me a lot of flexibility, so I said, I can go sit in that office while we look for someone else, or while Rosemary gets well and comes back. And then Rosemary did not come back. She recovered. It was fine, but just not for her to come back. And then I kept doing it. We couldn't find anyone. I kept doing it. And finally, I just admitted I was now the church administrator for this little fellowship on Galveston Island, Texas. And the thing about a small UU congregation, especially a lay-led UU fellowship, is if you have any leadership ability at all, the next thing you know, you're the church administrator of that UU fellowship. And I was preaching on a regular basis. I was planning to do a history degree, a master's and then possibly a doctorate in history at Rice University. But the idea came up about going to seminary and making leadership within our shared faith tradition a center of my calling in life. So I started at a seminary in Houston, made it through half a semester before I realized that wasn't going to work at a conservative Methodist seminary in Houston, and found my way because of a district assembly and a professor from Meadville Lombard who came to that district assembly as a lecturer. I found my way to Chicago, and I found my way to the Meadville Lombard Theological School in 2006. While I was at the Meadville Lombard Theological School, I was looking for a church that I could attend. I wanted a larger congregation than my 100-member lay-led fellowship on Galveston Island, and I was kind of touring around the congregations. And I went to visit the Evanston congregation, the Unitarian Church of Evanston. And I walked into the office of the Reverend Barbara Peskin, and I said, I'm a seminarian at Meadville Lombard, and I'm looking for a congregational home. She's like, that's nice, because that's Barbara, right? She goes, that's nice, but you want to be a military chaplain? Yeah. The Great Lakes Naval Station would like a Unitarian Universalist military service. How about we do that together? So in 2007, I had the privilege of being the co-founder of what is continuing as the UU Military Ministry of the Great Lakes Naval Station, which has had Unitarian Universalist worship service for those 40,000 Navy recruits a year for the last 17 years. And I am deeply honored. I am deeply honored by the congregations that have supported that ministry and all the volunteers that have kept that ministry alive in the years since. In this area, I went on to become the intern at the Unitarian Church of Evanston, and I became the district, we called it district minion, but the district assistant for the Central Midwest District. And I did my clinical pastoral education residency at Advocate Lutheran General Hospital here in northwest suburbs of Chicago. I then went on from there to serve as the interim minister for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Midland, Michigan. And then I went to serve as the assistant minister for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ventura, California. After several years there, I was asked if I would come back on the UUA staff to be the district executive of the Joseph Priestley District, which is the Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore area. And I will tell you, having a military chaplain in that role was useful on more than one occasion. And then served for a year on the New England regional staff of the UUA before they invited me in 2019 to come to be your regional lead of the Mid-America region. And that has been a journey. That's a very quick synopsis of the civilian ministry because I wanted you to have it for context. Because throughout that entire time, for the last 18 years, I've had a second job. And one of the things about being a reserve U.S. Army chaplain, I'll talk about the dynamics of reserve chaplaincy compared to active duty chaplaincy in a minute, but one of the things about being a reserve chaplain is that you have to also maintain civilian employment. Because being a reserve chaplain, and the Army Reserves in particular, is the way the U.S. government maintains a large military without paying for it, right? And at the same time, I love getting to be a reserve chaplain. I don't think I would have liked being on active duty very much at all. But being a reserve chaplain has really been in my heart. So I started as a chaplain candidate, which is an internship program in the United States military for seminarians who are studying to become ministers to see what it would be like to explore what it means to be a military chaplain. They are commissioned. I was commissioned second lieutenant in 2007 and served as a chaplain candidate for the next 3 years. I currently have 7 chaplain candidates that I supervise or senior rate. And for a while, I had even more involvement in the chaplain candidate program. I then served as a chaplain candidate. I had the privilege to be a research fellow at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., studying combat stress and resilience, or what are the ways that we can help soldiers to prepare for the stresses of the combat environment so that they are more likely to be able to come home with less, not none, but less combat stress injury. That was a wonderful experience at the U.S. military's senior graduate school. I will say that one of the fascinating things about that was I was walking around in my second lieutenant rank, and lieutenant generals get the coffee at National Defense University. They had to give me a special staff badge so that I could make it to meetings on time because everybody stopped me to wonder what a lieutenant was doing there. And there's a thing about general officers. They remember when they were lieutenants, before they had made all of the different compromises and decisions that they did in their military career. And they wanted, I put it at the time, they remembered what it felt like to be a pure form of life. And so they would stop me to tell me the entirety of their military career in the hallway while I was already late for a meeting with my colonel, who was my boss. It was a wonderful experience, but I also had the privilege to go and spend a week shadowing the chaplains at Arlington National Cemetery and seeing the depth of that ministry, where those chaplains, I will respect them for the rest of my life. They do 5 memorial services a day. And they do every single one with crisp precision, with pastoral care, representing this country, and I think it's best. I then had the privilege when I was accessioned as a chaplain, and the ceremony to accession me as a chaplain was in 2010 at the General Assembly, the UUA General Assembly in 2010. I went to serve as the battalion chaplain for the 414th Civil Affairs Battalion in Southfield, Michigan. Civil affairs, who has ever heard of civil affairs in the military? A few people. Civil affairs are the US military's diplomats. They're the people who work with local communities to address concerns that local community has about US military involvement. They're the ones who help maintain the key relationships. And I will tell you, that was a great ministry for me as a Unitarian Universalist military chaplain, to be there with those soldiers that are trained for that mission. The Army then discovered that I had done this thing called a clinical pastoral education residency, and discovered then that I was qualified for Army Medical Command. And for the next 9 years, I thought I would never get out. I served as the junior hospital chaplain for the 349th Combat Support Hospital in Bell, California, the battalion chaplain for the 145th Multifunctional Medical Battalion in Garden Grove, California, the battalion chaplain for the 439th Multifunctional Medical Battalion at Fort Dix, New Jersey, the brigade chaplain for the 8th Medical Brigade, and then the senior hospital chaplain for the 865th Combat Support Hospital in Utica, New York, and Niagara Falls, New York. And those 9 years were incredible. As a reserve chaplain, it meant that I would go on the weekend and I would be with doctors and nurses, and I would be with ER techs, and we would set up the hospital. One of the missions that we did was when I was with the New York Combat Support Hospital, was we took our hospital and we set it up in a community that didn't have one here in the United States. We took our hospital and set it up in West Memphis, Arkansas. And for a month, we provided real-world medical care to a community at no cost. We distributed over $2.5 million worth of pharmaceuticals and prescriptions. We cut 2,000 pairs of eyeglasses. And I will tell you, one of the things I most loved about that mission was one of the residents there had said to me, Reverend Pyle, Pastor Pyle, they knew Pastor, Pastor Pyle, how many pairs of eyeglasses are you all going to cut? And I said, well, we brought enough to do 2,500 eyeglasses. And she looked at me and said, well, that's going to make such a difference, because people in this town, they can't drive. And that's because they can't see. And so I just have this belief that, I don't know if it's true, but the traffic incidents went down because we gave them 2,000, and our soldiers got training using the equipment that we would use overseas. It was one of the best missions I think I've gotten to do as an Army Reserve chaplain. In 2019, I deployed twice. In 2020, sorry. I deployed as, do you all remember when during the early days of the COVID pandemic, the US military was sending medical teams into civilian hospitals? Do you remember that? I went with 2 of those medical teams as the chaplain and teaching biomedical ethics. And I am deeply grateful that I got to do that ministry. After that, when I came back, the command chaplain said, thank you for doing this mission. Is there anything we can do for you? And I said, will you let me do something other than medical? And they did. So I went to become the Deputy Command Chaplain of the Army Reserve Sustainment Command, which is based out of Birmingham, Alabama. It's the part of the military that manages contracts on behalf of the US government. And I will tell you, that was also a great ministry, because in that ministry, I had an additional duty. And that additional duty was as the course manager for a program called Chaplaincy Success. The only people who love acronyms more than Unitarian Universalists are the United States military. Chaplaincy is the Chaplain Basic Officer Leader course. It's basic training for military chaplains. And I did mine in 2007. But Chaplaincy Success was a program created by the Army Reserve and by this one unit, the 377th Theater Sustainment Command, because we wanted to make sure that new chaplains and chaplain candidates were prepared for that basic training environment before they went. And so what it meant was that I got 30 or so brand new chaplains to the Army every year for their first real experience of military training for a week at Joint Reserve Base New Orleans. And one of the things I loved about that was each year I would stand up in front of the class on the Sunday night before training started, and I would say to them, "My name is Chaplain Major David Pyle. I'm your course manager. We've been communicating in email. I am the Deputy Command Chaplain of the Army Reserve Sustainment Command, and I am a Unitarian Universalist. And if you can't deal with that, we need to know that now before we spend any more money on you. Because this is a pluralistic ministry where we are of many different faith traditions but are sharing the same congregation. And we have to be able, your faith has to allow you to serve in ministry with people who believe different things than you. Oh, and by the way, let me introduce you to my boss, Chaplain Lieutenant Colonel Diane Ricci. And if you can't be in ministry with ministers who are women, we also need to know that now. And I loved that ministry. I loved teaching chaplain candidates at the early phases of their ministry career in the military. After 4 years with the Army Reserve Sustainment Command, I was given the opportunity to go to one of the few combat arms units in the Army Reserve, and that's the unit I serve now. And that is Expeditionary Combat Aviation Brigade based out of Fort Knox. I have been with that unit now for 3 months. And I will tell you, it is as complicated as any unit I have ever been in. But in that unit, I supervise or I senior rate, one level above, 17 different people. And I do that as a reserve chaplain. One of the things I love is that in my unit that I currently serve, I serve with a Roman Catholic priest. I serve with 2 Southern Baptists. I serve with a member of the Reformed Christian Church. And I serve, and all of us we're not in an interfaith relationship. We are serving the same congregation. And that requires me to do some of my own work in how to do ministry in that environment. So I want to tell a couple of quick stories about why I am an Army chaplain. So in 1994, I was an intelligence soldier doing counter-narcotics work out of the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, El Salvador. It was a good mission, working for the DEA, doing intelligence analysis. When I got a phone call, I came into my office at 7 a.m. that morning, and I got a phone call. And it was my chaplain back at what's now Fort Liberty in North Carolina. And he said, "David, have you talked to your mom?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Call your mom, then call me back." I called my mom, and she told me that my father, who had also been in the U.S. military, who had been in many ways my hero, that he had died of a massive heart attack the day before. And I talked with her for a few minutes, and then I called my chaplain back, and he said, "All right, I got one question for you. Are you going to stay, or are you going home?" And I thought in that moment, and I said, "Well, you know, my mission is pretty important. There's no one to replace me. I think I have to stay." And he said, "Wrong answer. I was giving you a chance to be an adult. We've already worked it out. You're going home." And and they'd already had somebody spun up to come in to replace me. They already had plane tickets bought for me. My chaplain did all of that overnight. He was giving me a chance to be a grown-up, but he had done all of that overnight. And I found out at 7 a.m. That morning. By 10 p.m. that night, I was giving my mother a hug in her living room. When people ask me why I chose to become an Army Reserve chaplain, that's the story that comes to me. That idea that to be able to be there for these young men and women and these young siblings in times of difficulty and trial to be the expression of the United States military and the United States government caring about them as individuals in an environment that doesn't always do that well. That is a ministry that has lifted my soul. I think of this as, you ever met anyone who has a passionate love of fishing? They have the bass boat, they have the greatest new lures, they watch videos on television about fishing. You've met them? They spend way too much money on this. That's what military chaplaincy, reserve military chaplaincy is for me. My vocation, my calling is to serve our congregations and our faith. But military chaplaincy is the thing I get to be passionate about and love and do for fun. And that is the place that it rests in my life, is that gift. And I have the gift of a spouse who also we met on the Bosnia mission, is also a veteran. And so we've been able to make space for this for the last 17 years, for me to have two ministries and be in both roles. I'll tell one other quick story. As a sergeant, I kept getting in trouble. Because instead of doing my job, which was as being an intelligence analyst, I would wander around and talk to people. Sergeant Pyle, what are you doing in the motor pool? You work in the sensitive compartment and information facility. Get in the sensitive compartment and information facility. But yes, First Sergeant, it's really boring there. Get in the sensitive. So I had to find the one job in the United States military where it's literally my job to wander around and talk to people. And if I had known as an intelligence and security person that people will let the chaplain go anywhere, I'd have found out a way to use that to test security in places. So what does it mean to be an Army chaplain? So under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, the purpose of the Army Chaplain Corps is the protection of the free exercise of religion in the military. In a military environment, it is very difficult and very easy for the military to lose protecting the rights of soldiers as individuals. And so the law purpose of the Chaplain Corps is to be the officer, the staff officer who is there to protect the rights of all of the service members to practice their faith. We often don't see it portrayed that way in public media or in other places, but that is what allows the Army Chaplain Corps to exist. For me to be a minister, paid, not a lot as a reservist, but paid by the federal government. And I will tell you, I have, through that responsibility, I have done dozens upon dozens of religious accommodation interviews as a part of the process to help a soldier to get an accommodation from military regulations or rules or schedules or practices in order that they can accommodate their faith. One of the claim to fames that I have is that I helped the process and did the interview for the first Army Reserve soldier of Norse pagan beliefs to be able to wear a beard. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but to me and to that soldier, it was a big deal. I will also tell you that I did, I think it's 72 religious accommodation interviews during the time period that the military was mandating the COVID vaccine for people that did not want to take that vaccine. And some of those were, I think, really valid religious accommodations, and some of them were not. And being able to be the military officer that is managing the process of protecting the religious practice rights of our service members has been a gift. I have also, on a couple of occasions, been called upon to interview soldiers on conscientious objection, to be able to be the military officer that is helping to assess why a soldier can no longer or cannot perform some military activity because of their deeply held values and beliefs. And in each of those occasions, I've been deeply honored to be the soldier that's part of that process. Army chaplains are required by law, by Army regulation, to perform or provide. So if for service members who need some form of religious support, I am responsible for performing that religious support or finding what is necessary to provide that religious support. Does that make sense to everyone? And that has meant doing everything from leading Protestant worship at Army Reserve centers and bases, which I have the privilege to do. And I will tell you, as a Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist Christian, I love leading Protestant worship because I'm able to bring interpretations of Christian scripture that maybe they don't hear very often into those spaces. I also have had at times, because Unitarian Universalism is an affirming faith tradition for service members that are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans-identified, been called upon to perform support, religious support for those service members when their own chaplain could not. Been in the space where that chaplain contacted me to come and be able to provide support for those service members. And I've also been deeply honored to do that. And I wish my colleagues would challenge themselves theologically a bit more. But being in relationship with them means I get to say that. Military chaplains also are called upon to provide religious, moral, and ethical leadership within a unit's military chain of command. A military chaplain serves on the personal staff of the commander of that unit. For right now, I serve as a personal advisor to the brigade commander for the unit that I serve. And that advisor is not just on how well the soldiers are doing, but it's the ethical and moral implications of our mission and our purpose, and to advise that commander on those things. And I will tell you, in those moments and in those spaces where those conversations matter, I don't know about you, but I want Unitarian Universalist values at that table as we are doing that work together. Military chaplains are, by the Geneva Convention, non-combatants. We are not allowed to carry weapons of any kind, and by Army tradition, we're not even supposed to touch them or be photographed with weapons. That's both in Army regulation and Army tradition, and we have assigned to us what we call a religious affairs specialist. They are our military term, they are our force protection. Their job is to make sure that we stay alive on a battlefield. And I kind of somewhat jokingly refer to them when I try to explain my religious affairs sergeants that I have now, I have 2 of them, to someone. I say, imagine the best church administrator you have ever had. Make them 21 years old and give them a firearm. And that is what a religious affairs NCO is. They have their own roles and duties, but their primary role is to make sure that I survive the battlefield. And I'm deeply grateful for all of the religious affairs NCOs that have taken on that role with me over the years. Military chaplains are under a 3-tier authority system. So let me explain what that means. As the brigade chaplain for the 244th Expeditionary Combat Aviation Brigade, I am under the chain of command of my battalion commander. My battalion commander has command authority over me. And all of the work that I do in the unit is at her direction, right? We have a thing called a Commander's Master Religious Plan, and I am the officer that executes that religious plan within the unit. I am also under a technical authority of a chaplain senior to me. The way I describe this is my commander tells me what to do. My command chaplain guides, coaches, and informs me on how to do it well, right? And that's also true for me and the battalion chaplains that I supervise. But we have a 3rd level of authority, a 3rd person we are responsible to. And that is what is called our ecclesiastical endorser. So every military chaplain that is serving in the military has to be endorsed by one of a little over 240 different religious organizations that the military has authorized to endorse military chaplains. And Unitarian Universalism, the Unitarian Universalist Association, is one of those endorsing bodies. And so every one of our military chaplains and our chaplain candidates has received an official endorsement from the federal chaplaincy's endorser of the UUA, the Reverend Sarah Lambert. So for those of you who have ever been to the UUA's General Assembly and been to the Service of the Living Tradition, you may remember Reverend Lambert as the person who was guiding that ritual. But she has the religious chaplaincy endorser is a one-star equivalent to the military. And they have command authority over us. Just to give you an idea of what that means, she can tell me what to do, and if I don't do it, she can choose to rescind my endorsement. And I will have 30 days to find a new endorser, or I will no longer be in the United States Army. So it is that we military chaplains, we are under these three different levels of authority and responsibility, one of them representing the faith tradition. Remember I told you that some of my military chaplain colleagues have difficulty being in ministry with people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans-identified? Some of them have actually that their endorser has told them they are not allowed to be in ministry with people who are LGBTQIA. When the military chaplain corps, when the Army Chaplain Corps asked all the endorsers to state their position on whether their chaplains would be able to provide religious support to soldiers and families that were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans-identified, Reverend Lambert, my dear friend Sarah, she wrote a letter to the military that basically said, if I ever find out that any of my chaplains are not providing that ministry, tell me, because I'm going to take their endorsement away immediately. Right? And I will tell you the prophetic voice of saying that within the Army Chaplain Corps was profound, and I am deeply grateful for our faith tradition's commitment to representing that ministry in our faith within the U.S. military. So I have another story I want to tell. There are three things, we call them the three core competencies of the Chaplain Corps. The first is to nurture the living. Our job, first core competency, first thing that we say we do in the military is to take care of soldiers. In the Army, is to take care of soldiers. I remember a day that I was having some particular frustration with the Army and how the Army was caring for one of my soldiers. And I was on the phone with my battalion commander at the time, who's a really good guy, anesthesiologist. This was a hospital commander. I was on the phone with him, and I said in a moment of frustration, I said, "Sir, it's like the Army doesn't actually care about these soldiers at all." And he laughed, and he said, "Of course we do, Chaplain. That's why you're here." And there's a level of truth to that. The U.S. military is an institution that at its best remembers that they should care for soldiers. And I think we've done some work in the last few years to think about that. But its mission is to kill people and break things. Just to be blunt about what the purpose of the U.S. military is. And in that environment, if there is not someone who has at the first of their heart and their mind a purpose of caring for soldiers and their family members, then it falls by the wayside. And that the first core competency, the first purpose of the Army Chaplain Corps is to nurture the living, is a deep pastoral call. Some of that is theological. Some of that is religious. A lot of that is just human. Being able to care for my soldiers, to be an ethical advisor to them, to tell them when they're being just dumb, and to have them know that someone cares about them. To be, in some ways, a first-line social worker in the U.S. military, and to be the person paying attention to the morale of the whole unit. It is a gift to be able to do that ministry and bring that presence, in my mind, presence of care and the divine into spaces where it doesn't always naturally come. The second core competency of the Army Chaplain Corps, the second thing we say is the thing we bring, is to care for the wounded. The thing about being in the Army is there will be people that are wounded and killed in any war. It is going to happen. And having someone who is there to care not just for the physical care, but the spiritual care of soldiers that we as a country invite to go into these invite order to go into these very difficult circumstances, to bring that intentional care for those who have been wounded both physically and spiritually by the wars our nation chooses to fight, I think is another example of what wouldn't happen if we didn't have someone in the military intentionally dedicated to that purpose. And as a medical command chaplain, it was a center, and an Army hospital chaplain, it was a center of my work. One of the examples I want to tell is that in a mass casualty situation, in a situation where more than 4 soldiers have been wounded at once, one of the things that happens is that the chaplain goes to the soldiers that we don't think we can save. The soldiers who are, and judging who we can save and who we can't, it is the chaplain that goes to be with those soldiers that are going to die and to be present with them in that moment. I have never been called upon to do that in the real world, blessedly, but in exercises I have on more than one occasion, and I will tell you, even when I know it's an exercise, it is spiritually hard to be there in that space. And to know that someone is bringing that presence so that soldiers will not die alone is another gift of being able to be in this ministry. To do memorial ceremonies, to do hasty memorials, to be in military ceremonies is part of the third competency of the Army Chaplain Corps, and that is to honor the fallen. It's the Army Chaplain Corps that once again is the officer, the intentional officer, to bring the remembrance that those who die in military service, someone should be focused on making sure that we honor their memory. And that responsibility to ensure that the Army is taking that responsibility intentionally is a responsibility held by the Army Chaplain Corps and the Command Sergeant Majors together. One of the things I have had the privilege to do, I talked about being at Arlington, shadowing the chaplains at Arlington, who I will have deep respect for forever. I also had the privilege when I was a chaplain in Delaware to be part of the Dover Air Force Base mission, where families greet the loved ones that have died overseas. And I'm not going to tell any stories from that time, because those stories are the family stories to tell. But I will say being able to be with the families in that moment is another one of the great gifts that this ministry has given to me over the many years of service. A chaplain, however, is not simply a religious leader in the military. A military chaplain has to have 2 roles. You have to be able to be a religious leader in the military to provide pastoral care, to care for soldiers and their families, but you also have to be a staff officer. And the staff officer focused on how religion impacts the battlefield. The staff officer focused on how soldier morale and welfare impacts the unit's combat readiness. The staff officer that is focused on how to provide care for all of the service members. And one of the things that the U.S. military loves about Unitarian Universalist chaplains is we tend to be really good at both. And I'm not going to cast aspersions at any of my other colleagues and other traditions, but there's a thing about Unitarian Universalist military chaplains, whether it's our education or our social location, it is that we tend to be able to be good staff officers, as well as good teacher, preacher, prophet, pastors, as well as good religious leaders. And that's not always true in my experience of other faith traditions in the United States Army. I will say another thing. I have, as a staff officer, been privileged to have the opportunity to ask questions within that battalion staff or that brigade staff that no one else has the lens to ask. To be able to say, how does this plan affect our families? How does this medical evacuation route, how is it impacted by the fact that we're in Ramadan? How to be able to have that lens of a religious leader and a staff officer within the military brings, I think, a level of complexity that not all that military units wouldn't have if they were not military chaplains. So I want to add one more complicated piece. All the things that I've been talking about have been all military chaplains, right? Across all the military services, in active duty. But as a reservist, there's a whole different level of complication. The first one being, you have to maintain a civilian job. And I will tell you, the majority of reserve military chaplains do not do ministry in the civilian world because it's too difficult. Churches kind of wonder where their minister is when they're not there on a Sunday morning. And you also only get paid 4 days a month and up to 29 days a year for performing that ministry. And my soldiers have a whole life beyond those 4 days a month and 29 days a year that they need their chaplain for. You do all of this without the support that active duty chaplains would have on an active duty military base because your unit is in a reserve center in a small town in central Iowa or New York, not around where there are the substance abuse counselors and the emotional health counselors and the suicide prevention officers that are all part of an active duty military assignment. Reserve chaplains rarely have access to any of that. And we are working with soldiers who come into the military with often childhood trauma, with societal challenges, with relational issues. The majority of things I work with soldiers on have almost nothing to do with the military. The military just makes them worse. So why in the world do I keep doing this? I had one of my chaplain candidates a few years ago looked at me, knowing my work in Unitarian Universalism, knowing that there's obviously plenty of work that the Unitarian Universalist Association could find for me, asked me, "Sir, why do you keep doing this?" Actually, his phrase was, "How much longer are you going to do this, sir?" And I have a few reasons, and but that really he helped me to clarify. I said one before, that chaplains helped me multiple times in my career. I told you all one, but chaplains were there for me, and I think I have a responsibility to pay that forward as long as I can. I mentioned also that I am a personal advisor to that battalion or brigade or division commander. And as we're making the difficult decisions that are often a part of military service, I want our Unitarian Universalist values to be at that table and in that conversation. And I'm given the opportunity to bring those values. And I also have grown to love. Though I love my soldiers, I'll tell you, I have grown to love being in ministry with ministers from all the other faith traditions that serve in the U.S. military. I have loved the ministry with my Southern Baptist colleagues and with my Episcopalian colleagues and with my Mormon colleagues. I have had experiences, and I have grown in my understanding of Unitarian Universalism because of my relationship with them and their questions about our faith tradition. And I would miss it if my colleagues were all Unitarian Universalists. So I love that ministry. I love those relationships. And I love the opportunity to teach, to mentor and develop these young chaplains, these young seminarians and brand new chaplains from all these faith traditions, to mentor and teach them to maybe, just maybe, grow beyond some of the limitations of their theologies. And that gift, the placement to be able to be in that space, is another thing I probably wouldn't find much of anywhere else. And the United States military loves Unitarian Universalist military chaplains. Not all my colleagues do, but the United States military loves us. There is such a need for progressive chaplains in the U.S. military, and they know it. I talked about the need for providing ministry for service members that are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans-identified, but it's actually so much more than that. We actually, Unitarian Universalists, are able to ask questions that nobody else does. And one of the things about being a UU means that I am public in being a progressive in the military. And so I find that one of the other things that happens is senior officers, not chaplains, will sometimes reach out to me because they just want to know what progressives are going to think about something before they do it. And good gosh, I am glad I'm glad that they have my phone number. One of the things I wanted to say is because, one of the examples of why the military, that the military loves Unitarian Universalist military chaplains is that there is an award. It's known as the Distinguished Service Award. It is offered to one chaplain per each branch, per each component. So 11 chaplains a year are offered this award. One for the active duty Army, one for the Army Reserve, one for the Army National Guard, Air Force for the 3 components, Navy, one per year. In the last 10 years, 5 of those awards have gone to Unitarian Universalists, including myself as the Army Reserve Chaplain of the Year in 2021. This past year, it went to 2 Unitarian Universalists in the same year. Chaplain Captain Greg DeBow, who serves on the active duty Air Force, was named the Air Force Chaplain of the Year. And Chaplain Major Lynn Perez, who lives here in Illinois, was named the Civil Air Patrol Chaplain of the Year. The Civil Air Patrol is the Air Force Auxiliary. There are currently 34 Unitarian Universalist military chaplains and chaplain candidates across all of the branches. And I will tell you that there are more people who are communicating and in process as we speak to consider this ministry. And when I became a chaplain candidate, I was number 4, 17 years ago, to know the difference of that. And the person I mentioned earlier, Reverend Sarah Lammert, she not only has served as our endorser for, I think it's over a decade now. For multiple years, she was the chair of the National Council on Ministry to the Armed Forces, the organization of all of the 200-plus religious endorsers that endorse chaplains to the U.S. military. I just love that they had to choose the chair to be a Unitarian Universalist. That just lights my soul. Because maybe, I don't know, but I think it was, they couldn't agree with each other, so they chose the UU. I don't know if that's what happened. Most of our chaplains are on active duty because reserve chaplaincy is so hard. And because this is a thing, the law, the Uniformed Service Members Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, that protects reserve service members, that, if you get deployed, you get your job back when you come home, it doesn't apply to religious employers. And so one of the risks that we take, and I am blessed that the Unitarian Universalist Association chose to abide by USERRA, even though they're not required to in my ministry. So I'm going to move past that. So I think I want to stop there and just say that I have probably about 9 years left that the military will let me do this. And I wonder every day, and I'll tell you, I wondered a bit this week, whether I can still do this or not. So usually it's the hips and knees that make me wonder that. But I love the fact that I get to represent our faith tradition in a community we don't often get to go to. I love the fact that I get to be a presence in the lives of these soldiers that cares about them first. And I probably will stay as long as they will let me. And so thank you. I want to take a moment and finish to show you a few photos of my time as a reserve U.S. Army chaplain. I'm taking away from the microphone. All of these, I'm not going to explain them all, but they are photos where you either can't see who the soldier is or soldiers that have given me permission to use the photo. There are other photos, but I didn't want to show any. Of just a few. That is me on ABC News, by the way, when during 2007. Anybody ever seen the book Bless All Who Serve? That produced by Skinner House Books? I have an essay in there. I will tell you that the photo at the top right, well, my right, your left, that is the chaplain resource table at the hospital that we set up in West Memphis, Arkansas, to provide religious resources to all the people that came to get services at our hospital. The one in the center was a UU military chaplains retreat where they made us all jump off telephone poles. so just the thing. And the one at the top left, your left, was my chapel in Garden Grove, California, where I had the privilege to. We built that chapel out of a disused medical storage building. I gave up my office for that building so that we could have an actual chapel space. All the soldiers there doing push-ups that you see, those are all chaplain candidates in the Chibolic Success Course. And trust me, I made them do a lot of push-ups. And below that, next to them, with a bunch of soldiers next to the ship, that's a class of Chibolic Success at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. These are some of my chaplain candidates and chaplain assistants. Well, we call them religious affairs specialists now over the years that I've had privilege to serve with. And you can notice something, that serving in the military chaplaincy has been, I believe the military chaplaincy is probably the most multicultural, multiracial ministry within Unitarian Universalism. Up there on the top left again, that is the chapel, Sustainers Chapel in Birmingham, Alabama, where I was the chaplain for 4 years. And below that was my chapel in an exercise at Fort McCoy. Just a couple last photos. Another one of my pictures of one of my teams. And of me doing a chapel service. One particular. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to respond to any questions. And I realized I went long. Sorry about that.
All right, so if you have any questions, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic up over. Hey, Joe.
Thank you very much. I have actually two-level little story here. One has to do with my personal experience finding Unitarian Universalism in a military context. I was an Air Force captain in an Air Force base in Germany, at Ramstein, you may remember the name. And at the center hub of the commercial part of the base, there was a kiosk that spelled out the religious experiences due up on Sunday morning. Chapel 1, Chapel 2, and the various denominations were listed on the board there. Chapel 1, Protestant, Chapel 2, Catholic, whatever, and they would alternate. And down in the lower right-hand corner was the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship would meet at the base theater.
Yep.
And I thought, I had no this has to be an interesting group of folks who meets not in Chapel 1 or 2, but in the base theater. So fast forward to now I'm out of the Air Force. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm working in a business center that's across the street from the UUCA, Unitarian Universalist Church
Of Atlanta. Yep.
1971 and 2, when Gene Pickett was the minister at the Atlanta congregation, and my then relatively new wife were looking for a religious community, and I was aware of the fact that on Sunday mornings along the access road of I-85, they would park, blocks and blocks down the access road to get to that church, and we thought, there must be some connection, some reason to go there. So we did. It was 1972, and we've been Unitarian Universalists ever since. So fast forward now again to our boy. Now we're here in Illinois, and this is I'm bordering up to my question, which has to do with my son, my second son, who both of our boys came through the religious education curriculum here at this church, and they went off to college and had their life. My second son went to West Point and was graduate class of '96, and while he was at West Point, he was in the bagpipe band. He was in the band at Naperville North High School as a trombone player, and he went into the bagpipe band at West Point, which had a Catholic chaplain as their OIC.
Yep.
Now, my son, who was born and raised and brought up in our family as progressive religionist, and went through all the Unitarian Universalist RE curriculum, and he came out of the Army as a very devout Christian participant theologically. Now, some of it I have to admit may have been influenced by his wife, who was a
Missouri Synod Lutheran.
To me in particular, but I thought this chaplain might have had almost a little too much influence from a proselytizing standpoint.
Yeah.
As to the nature of salvation and all that sort of stuff. Not to belabor the point, but thank you for your service, Chaplain Major, and done a nice job.
Well, thank you. So thank you for that. And I want to say that, yes, proselytizing is not authorized by U.S. Army chaplains, but sharing of your values and beliefs when a soldier invites you to is. And the line between those two things is very thin and sometimes hard for people to be able to hold too well. I will say this. I tell the chaplains that I teach and the chaplains that I supervise that in civilian ministry, my job is to be the public expression of my faith as a Unitarian Universalist, to be able to be to represent and bring the values of our faith tradition into the places and spaces of the world and in the places that they are most needed. In military chaplaincy, my faith as a Unitarian Universalist is my strength to be with people in the best and the worst moments of their lives. And it's a two different place for how you hold your own values and beliefs. So I thank you for your story, and you may have, I wouldn't doubt your instinct there. And I'm glad that you raised a child who could be able to hear that where their spirit was calling them to. So thank you.
Any other questions?
So I think around a dozen years ago, we had a Sunday morning service where happened to be a gentleman was here attempting to become a chaplain who was an atheist. Does anybody else remember this? Okay, I told her about it. And was encountering difficulty. And now I'm wondering if it was the lack of a sponsoring organization.
Yeah, probably lack of an ecclesiastical endorser.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that has not changed. That person would still need to find, I mean, they felt called to do this, and
Yeah.
we're here to speak on that topic, but they would still have to find some organization.
A recognized ecclesiastical endorser to endorse them to military chaplaincy.
Okay,
Yes.
so they may have been here seeking one from us. I'm not sure how that turned out. Okay, thank you.
I will say this, Unitarian Universalism, some people in the chaplain corps think that we're the catch-all, and that we're not. I mean, you know, having a practice in our congregations, having an understanding having a relationship within Unitarian Universalism is a requirement to be able to be endorsed as but I have people contact me all the time to think, you know, I can't find an endorser somewhere else where you all endorse me. And we've talked before about whether we wanted to take on that role, and the answer is no. We are a Unitarian Universalist tradition. We endorse people who are in fellowship as Unitarian Universalist ministers.
Reverend Bob, I would like you to share with the folks who are here your answer to me when I asked about the crosses on the
Yeah.
lapels. This is the first time I got an answer, not to speak for also getting a very good answer.
I'm happy to share. So the question that was asked was, why do Unitarian Universalist chaplains wear the cross? For those that are further in the back, you can't see them, but right there. The book answer, and I'll give the book answer first and then the deeper answer. The book answer is the military classifies Unitarian Universalism as a Protestant religion. One of my Roman Catholic colleagues and dear friends once framed that for me in a way that stuck with me. He said, yes, you all are so Protestant, you protest whether or not you're Christian. That we are the furthest bud on the furthest branch of the Protestant tree. And that is true because the military likes to classify things. It's also true that our endorser would be the one to make the decision to request otherwise, to request that we wear the chalice, and has chosen not to do that. And the reason for that is because doing so, taking off these crosses, would be choosing to marginalize ourselves within the chaplain corps. While I'm wearing this cross, while I am considered by the U.S. military to be a Christian chaplain, the other chaplains have to figure out how to hold that theologically, have to figure out how to understand that within the realm of what it means to wear that cross is not only them, but also me. And the other reason, though, is that the cross is recognizable. Soldiers see that and they know what your role is. And most of my soldiers, they have no idea what a Unitarian Universalist is, and they don't need to. What they need to know is that I am their chaplain who cares about them and who will be there for them and will pay attention to their humanity in the midst of what could be inhumanity. And but I'll tell you that one of those reasons that I like the most is that it makes some of my colleagues so uncomfortable that I'm wearing this cross. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let's go here. Oh, it's back on. Thanks, Beth. We welcome you all tomorrow to attend a co-led service, and so we hope to see all of you here in the morning, bright and early.
And I will
Or a
be
little
Reverend
later.
David Pyle tomorrow.
Reverend David Pyle. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.